Right. I know a couple of you are already in the room, so I'll just let you know we're still letting people into the room. So we'll wait probably about 1 more minute to see how many more we get in. Shan't be long. Still going up, which is awesome. Reconciliation week. I hope you are all getting some time to sit back and do a bit of reflecting. Numbers are still going up, so I won't formally kick off till those numbers settle a little bit. If you can hear the beeping in the background, that's my washing machine. It's a bit noisy. No, it's not. It's the fridge. Because that's what you do. You leave your fridge door open. Right. I just deal with that child. Right. Room admissions are still coming in. But while everyone's coming in, I might begin by doing our acknowledgement, particularly important during Reconciliation Week. And as an Arundel, a person from the Central Region, is always really important for me to acknowledge that I'm sitting on the lands of the Boonwurrung here in Naarm, feeling really refreshed actually. I've just come back from Uluru, which is my grandmother's country, and our story for that place is the punia, you know, the big female snake that carries their eggs, and it was just really lovely to be there with the nanas and the mums and the all my cousins talking about the stories for that place. And again, an incredible reminder to me about how important our kinship lines are and our ways of nurturing each other are, because while we lost my nana, who was the granddaughter for Gunagana. So Gunagana, if you ever go and do a genealogy and you look at Uluru, Gunagana is the senior lawman for that place, and that was my nana's grandfather. Anyhow, when we go to Murujulu, because our nana is now gone, all our other nanas kick in and care for us and make sure that we know how special she was, and make sure we know they call it Hawkeye, which is Hawkeye, the Hawkeye line, and this is your job, this is your story, this is your dance. And it again reinforces just how incredible it is to have kinship structures that understand that even when you lose people, you need people and you need to be loved, even as adults, as grandchildren, have those safe places. I think our numbers are starting to settle, so I'll formally kick off now with acknowledging the lands on which all of you mob come to us today. This is part of our new artwork, actually, if no one's seen it before. We've been updating our slides and again bringing forward the new energy of our new team. So these slides were a combination of a bit of work internally from one of our young artists and a bit of work from our graphic artists that we've been doing, working alongside for a very long time. I'll also take the moment to introduce you to a couple of guests. You'll see up in the panels there, Mr. Garth Morgan, who's the CEO of QATSIP, and he's a member of our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander leadership group on Safe and Supported, and Mr. Jamie Crosby, who is the convener of the National Coalition and CEO of Families Australia. So they're joining us for this really important conversation today on Safe and Supported. I'm assuming you all know what it is, but just in case you don't, Safe and Supported is the national framework to reduce child abuse and neglect and its intergenerational impacts, and it's a platform for a new way of working between governments and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I'm going to repeat that. Well, I know I've said it's a new platform. It is actually a precedent-setting framework. We have never before negotiated anything in shared partnership. So when we talk about what voice looks like like in policy, this is the first time we've actually been able to do it. Again, the first time means a lot of learning lessons, and I'm sure if we were to negotiate it in 3 years' time, it would even look different to how it looks today. So some of those things we'll talk you through today so you understand what it looks like when we use shared partnership and we start putting it into policy, and how it potentially changes practice, but absolutely precedent-setting work. So Aboriginal, as you know, the reason we've come up with this framework, and it's something that all of you in the room are intensely involved in it, and it's your day-to-day business, is understanding that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who are experiencing disadvantage or who are vulnerable have to be a key priority group. And you'll see that these are our priorities and our focus areas. And if we're going to have any chance of addressing the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in child protection systems, it has to be up there as a key focus area. It is, as I said, the first of its kind. It is the first major framework negotiated under the Closing the Gap agreement, and we've learnt a lot of lessons along the way. A key part of Safe and Supported, of course, has been making sure that the priority reforms of closing the gap under the new agreement are embedded all the way through, and that includes Priority Reform 1, which is partnership and shared decision making. Many of you would have been part of the consultations that we led in our ability to bring forward your voices to this particular plan and the actions that will sit underneath it. It's now at a really, really exciting point where we start talking about implementation. Certainly still a lot of work to be done on how we get implementation happening, but again, really encouraging to see the momentum happening at this moment in time. And again, another reason why we're so happy to have so many in the room with us today, because we know it's a tough year and it's going to be a very tough year for Aboriginal people. So sometimes being able to see progress and what that progress looks like is an important thing to do. The other thing we're cognizant of is, as we're looking at implementation, is we don't know how long moments in time last, because these things are sometimes very vulnerable to government changes. And when I say government changes, are whoever's in government at any time. So what we're trying to do is work with the sector, work with governments to dig these roots in deep. So it doesn't matter. It's not going to get hit too badly if someone comes along and changes their mind and comes up with a better idea, which is, as we know, what happened to us many, many, many times over and over and over again. So Safe and Supported in and of itself will be delivered through 2 sets of action plans, which were endorsed by all community service ministers. So you might see this throughout the PowerPoint referred to as CSM, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Leadership Group, which I'll also abbreviate to Leadership Group, and it's supported by the National Coalition of Child Safety and Wellbeing, which we'll condense to National Coalition, which is who Jamie represents here today. The action plans were launched in January this year. And again, it was the first time we were able to have a dedicated Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander action plan. And those of you who follow international progress in this area will know that where we've seen big shifts internationally, it's where there have been dedicated national plans for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and children. Both of the action plans, however, represent a profound opportunity to bring about meaningful change and work towards better outcomes for children and families across Australia. The first action plan addresses the needs of all children and focuses on children and families who are experiencing disadvantage and or are vulnerable. It was developed in consultation with the National Coalition on Child Safety and Wellbeing. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Action Plan sets out the strategic actions and activities to achieve Target 12 of Closing the Gap, which is about reducing the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care. And I don't need to remind anyone in the room today of how off track those targets are and how concerned everyone in this room is about the need for fundamental transformation in the way we work. Both of the action plans were developed in partnership with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Leadership Group, which we convened, and I have the great honour of being able to chair. If we move slides, we talk about how it was done. So how did you get this done? Because again, these things haven't been used before. These tools haven't been built before. In order to work in partnership, we needed to really test what does shared decision making look like. It sounds like a really easy thing to do, but fundamentally we all had to change the way we work. So for people like me who represent the needs of the sector, we had to learn to go from shouting and saying, listen to our voice, to working in a different way that said, listen, here's the concerns of the sector. What is it's blocking? What do we need to do differently? And how do we do that? And how do we ensure that the whole way along we're being transparent and honest about the types of work that we're doing? But also, how do we use this amazing new agreement that we've got to its full potential? And that's what we had to do. It was an incredible process to go through. And as I've said a bit earlier, we learned a lot of lessons along the way. It makes a big difference though, because those frameworks have genuinely set us at the decision-making table. And again, you hear those things being talked about. But what does it mean to actually be at the decision-making table? It means that no decisions are made without us in the room or without us being to influence. So not guests at the table, actually having a conversation about what works, what doesn't work, and where do we find the middle line. Working in partnership, of course, has enabled us to develop these. They should be groundbreaking, right? If they have the will to implement, these action plans should be groundbreaking. And we're certainly pushing really hard now to make sure that those actions hit the ground in a timely manner. Critical, of course, to the success of the implementation of all of these activities in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Action Plan is to ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations lead the ongoing implementation and monitoring of the action. So that's, again, a really, really important part of making sure that those closing the gap priorities are embedded, because this isn't just about having a policy or an action plan. This is about, well, what does effective implementation look like? Who should lead it? How do we measure it? How do we make sure it's moving? And what are the mechanisms that we need to bring into place to ensure that the whole way through, we're not just listening to a good story? The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Action Plan also recognises that the systemic change that we need is because we sit in an environment of colonisation. And again, we don't shy away from that. That is the fundamental flaw in everything that we're working with. We're working amidst a government and policies and programs that were designed without us to erode our own ways of knowing how to self-govern and how to be self-determined. We know, though, these are really easy words to say. They're confronting words, but they're easy to get out. Changing the way we work is a whole nother story. And we're really conscious that without committed efforts to reform government services and invest in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-led decisions to change policies, we're not going to get any traction. And again, this is like you moving dinosaurs in car parks, right? We've got to change the way governments have been used to doing this work. And a couple of those cars in those car parks are getting squashed. We know, however, that it's worth the effort, because what we'll see is better outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and the ability to build progress to reducing that overarching aim. And that is the number of seeing a downward trend in the number of our children in out-of-home care. If we move to slide 7, before hearing from our panelists, who I'm sure you're desperate to hear from because I've been talking for a long time, shame job. Thank you for listening to me. I want to take you on a tour of a couple of the key actions under the action plan. And these are the ones that you're likely to see first. And in actual fact, some of you who lead services or programs are probably already starting to see these hit the ground without actually understanding that this is where it comes from. And certainly I have been really pleased in the last couple of weeks to be out in communities all over Australia where people are saying, oh, is that what's happening? Is that why we're now able to apply for that particular piece of work? Or is that why we're able to think a bit more flexibly about what we can do? The first of the action plans, as I said, sets out a new agenda and actions to transfer authority in child protection to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and organisations across the country, including the delegation of legislative authority. And again, we know this is something that every room we went into, people asked for this to happen. Here it is in an action plan. We see better outcomes from our families when they have the opportunity to lead decision-making for the care and protection of children through their own independent processes. We also know that we want to see the transfer authority in child protection to our families and communities through delegated statutory authority and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander family-led decision-making. And those two things are inseparable. What we understand, and we understand this because of the evidence that our sector and our communities bring forward all the time, is that where authority is delegated to our organisations for child protection decisions, the power that child protection held over our communities is interrupted. It's absolutely interrupted. When we have control, we achieve better outcomes that reunify our children and keep them safely connected to family, community, and culture. And again, we have evidence that supports that, and Garth will be able to talk to some of that when he comes online shortly. When we talk about the second action, and that is to grow the Aboriginal and community-controlled organisations, we know that fundamentally those organisations were built for our communities. Our elders fought for these things because fundamentally they understood that in order to get better outcomes from our families, we needed to nurture our families. And that way we stop all the tertiary interventions. So that's what we want to see. We want to see more early supports to prevent child protection contact in the first place, not interrupt it, stop it happening in the first place. We know from our Family Matters report that funding that goes into early supports is less than 17% of all child protection funding. An even smaller proportion of that goes to ACCOs. In fact, it's a really, really small proportion of that funding goes to ACCOs. We know that the community-controlled sector will need to grow to be ready to take on the additional work that statutory decision-making authority will bring. This is big transformation. It will be big work. This action is part of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Action Plan, focusing on an investment strategy, right? So that's making sure you've got the resources, not only the resources to deliver, but the resources to grow. What is it that you're going to need to take on, and how is it that you're going to need to function? And again, those services, we're looking at those services that are being delivered by mainstream organisations, non-NGOs for a very, very long time. And they've had a long time to grow into those positions and to grow into that practice. But again, we are at fundamentally resolute on the fact that once those things are transferred and they're delivered through community-led and place-based approaches, we're going to see a different result. Part of this action, of course, is also to reform the funding model. So it's one thing to get a transfer of a service, but we actually need to look at the procurement policies that support the growth of the ACCO sector. That one is a headache for all of us, but we're moving on it. And we're starting to see, again, changes in the way governments work in understanding what is an effective procurement and what does effective procurement mean from an Aboriginal perspective, and how do we get into those rooms to make sure that Aboriginal people have some oversight on what's happening. These types of funding priorities will cover the 5-year life of the action plan, but we know we've got a lot of work to do to make them happen, and that work's got to start now. We've also heard jurisdictions committing to recommissioning family support services with a proportion of funding quarantined for Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, and we expect to see those jurisdictional plans for this to be developed by the end of the year. Again, these are all things that you asked for. And when I talk about voice and policy, this is your voice and policy coming through. If we start looking through the actions a little bit deeper, I'm going to take a minute to outline what's included under Action 5, which is active efforts to implement the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle. So as you know, the core premise of the child placement principle is the safety of the child. It is very, very closely aligned to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. This was developed again by our communities. This is what our communities told us that they needed, and it cuts right across the child protection system. The principle includes prevention, partnership, placement, participation, and connection. As such, although it's narrowly defined into a single element, and that is placement, it really spans the entire system as a holistic framework. These 5 elements aim to embed the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture in policy, practice, and support self-determination, and ultimately reduce the overrepresentation of our children in out-of-home care. We've had commitments in the past to implement this principle. In fact, it should have been fully implemented by 2020, and we're now in 2023. This is a really hard one to get right because governments have to change the way they work, and we have to find ways to measure this across every single jurisdiction. So what we have, though, for the first time, is a commitment to lift the standard of active efforts. And again, some of you will be familiar with this language. And those active efforts need to include national standards and plans for each state and territory to implement the child placement principle. So it's no longer good enough to say we're going to do it, put it on a shelf. We need to start looking at how we standardise this. This is a much higher standard for implementation than we've ever had before. And we're hopeful that it will go further than any earlier commitments. And we've also got, for the very first time, and again, in line with everything our communities called for, our organisations called for, we have a higher standard for accountability than we've ever had before. When we look at social determinants, and that's Action 8 in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Action Plan, this looks at those things that we all understand are absolutely necessary for our families to thrive. So that's access to universal services such as housing. And again, when you're looking for your voice in policy, what does it look like? Every single room we went into, housing came up almost immediately as a fundamental problem in our families being able to successfully raise their children. We know also that health has been a big impact on many of our communities, and we know that poverty, without fail, has a negative impact on how our families are viewed and our families' ability to be able to access the services that they need. We also know that these components are all underlying drivers of child protection involvement, and we also know they're underlying drivers of things like family violence, issues of substance use, and again, overcrowding. These are the things that all of you have told us. Commonwealth ministers with portfolio responsibilities for children and families have also confirmed their shared commitment to implementing the action plans and supporting our children and our families who are experiencing disadvantage or vulnerability. Again, when you're looking at what does voice look like in policy, this is one that the Aboriginal Leadership Group was resolute on. It is not it's a simple one, but experiencing disadvantage or vulnerability. That's talking to the fact that there are issues outside of our own control that often impact on our families. Once upon a time, those words would have been articulated differently. This will be really, really important and as part of our ability to take a cross-portfolio approach to systemic change. And again, that is what everyone in the rooms told us. They said, stop treating us as though we live in government departments. We don't. Stop the siloing. Stop passing our babies and the responsibility of our babies from department to partner. Again, we know this one's going to be a challenge, but it's also going to be an incredible opportunity for our member agencies in picking this up in all of your jurisdictions and using this as a mechanism to bring agencies like education and health to do their part in reducing the number of children in out-of-home care. And of course, we get the opportunity to discuss this a little bit more in our Q&A. But I want to take a quick moment to go over the overarching plan, which also has some things that are really interesting for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. So this one we'll look at early supports. So the first action plan, again, is for all families. And while it's not specific to us, again, you'll see the differences in it because the Aboriginal Leadership Group was, again, resolute in supporting the calls from all of our communities that even the plan for everyone had to have us in it. We need to be able to see us in there. Action 1 of the first action plan is to improve how early supports are delivered. Now, we know that child protection expenditure through the country is focused on the tertiary end of statutory intervention. And this one is about moving that, okay? How do we get that into early supports? The Safe and Supported framework as a whole includes a priority focus area that means that we're going to reduce the number of children coming into contact with child protection in the first place. The action really focuses on place-based initiatives, and that again is understanding that communities know what is happening in their own worlds. They know what the barriers are, and they are best able to articulate what is happening, but they usually know how to solve the problem as well. So this is about changing the starting point, being able to scope and design place-based approaches to early supports. We're hoping to see this underway within 3 years. We would like to see it a lot faster, to be perfectly honest. But again, we're moving dinosaurs in car parks. When we look at Action 5, now this one is about addressing a range of issues for improving the support of children who are in care or leaving care. And because we know that still happens, and probably there's going to be an element of it always. But we need to ensure that when that happens, our children are really, really well supported. So these things look at education, transitioning into employment, and improving access to a range of services like housing, health, and income support. Again, a significant part of this will need to include improving the capability of these service systems to respond to trauma affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families. And again, that one came up over and over again. How do you help families and children experiencing trauma? When we look at Action 6, this one is about disability. And again, what we heard was that children, parents, and carers with disability should be a priority group in the Safe and Supported framework, not an addendum, a priority group. They are actions there, and you'll see actions in both the action plans that focus in on this. While the data isn't really as good as we'd like it to be, it's not collected properly and it's not reported very well. We know from all the evidence that people like you bring into the rooms that parents, children with disability are significantly overrepresented in child protection systems, and their needs are not met. And again, we hear, I think it was last week or the week before, that the number of children, say, for example, in Banksia Hill, 80% of them had a learning disability. So we fundamentally understand the connection between adverse outcomes and the inability to get in fast enough. So what we're hoping to see here is an improvement in relationships between child and family services and the NDIS. We know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people access the NDIS at disproportionately low rates. In fact, I've heard it described in the Northern Territory, my home, where there are $1 million children out there, and some communities might have 2 or 3 of those $1 million children, not bringing down a single cent of support because their families aren't able to access it in the first place. So we know we have to improve that. The action also links to Action 8 in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Action Plan, and there'll be specific actions within it that enable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to improve those supports for their children, their parents, and their carers, all of them with disability. I've done a lot of talking, so I'm running out of breath, and I'm sorry, probably gone over time. Garth, I'm going to throw it to you, and I'm sorry if I've cut you short by talking too long. Garth, and again, to put it in a bit of frame, Queensland has already started down the path of a lot of the actions that we're on. So Garth, take it away.
Thanks, Catherine. I'll talk forever. You'll have to cut me off too. So before I begin, I also want to acknowledge traditional owners and acknowledge country. I'm coming in online today from Mianjin in Brisbane, and I want to pay my respects to elders from the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, as well as all of our elders across all our countries in this beautiful part of the world. So today, I want to focus in a little bit and talk about Action 1 in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Action Plan, which is delegated authority. And also, then I'll give you a bit of an overview on Action 4, which is about continuing to build the strength of our workforce as a sector. So if we could start with delegated authority, we're seeing more and more agencies across the place and in Queensland, especially using Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander family-led decision-making, or FLDM for short. And it's really to work with children and families who are at risk of or currently in contact with the child protection system. However, it's absolutely critical that FLDM is led by community-controlled organisations. In fact, it can only be led by community-controlled organisations to ensure that the models are culturally safe and the process is culturally valid for whichever place family-led decision-making is occurring and the meetings are being conducted. It is an important process that enables families and children to have yarn, a discussion about the real issues that are happening, but in a non-judgmental and a safe way, and to develop up solutions that will keep their children safe and connected. It can also include choosing the right living situations when children, cannot live with, their family for a time. And that includes broader extended mob as well as, mum and dad. FLDM really helps families to be empowered in a system that is often empowering. And we hear this all the time about how families are marginalised and their voices are not heard and things are being done to them. And FLDM really is an opportunity to build self-determination back into the system. It's a process that has the potential to truly implement the participation element of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle. And we would argue, and SNAICC would argue, all of us really, that this implementation of that placement principle needs to be the standard of active efforts. So it's not just a cursory checkbox. It's something that we really do take seriously, and we do it thoroughly and timely in a way that really is about everything that it takes. So FLDM is also about, through ensuring the element of, self-determination is embedded to give families a voice and choice of over how their children's safety and well-being needs can be effectively met. But it's also imperative to ensure that the plans that those families come up with and they're made through those processes are actually implemented and upheld by child protection and adopted and adapted into the case planning framework. And sadly, at least in Queensland in previous years, this hasn't always been the case. And this is why it's so important that we have delegated authority so that we're able to make decisions, for ourselves in this space. And the principal mechanism, for us doing this in Queensland is through the Delegated Authority Program. And so in Queensland and Victoria, the child protection legislation provides for government to transfer authority for child protection decisions to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisations. In Queensland, it's to the CEO, an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander CEO of a community-controlled organisation, get the powers and functions of the DG. It's a relatively recent development. So a few years, I think Victoria started before us. They're a couple of years ahead. And we are at different stages and different approaches in terms of its implementation. But what it means, the transfer of authority means that our community-controlled organisations can seek to take on responsibility for decision-making for our children and families in multiple areas across the child protection continuum. So that can include intake, investigation, assessment, ongoing intervention, including, reunification, family contact, cultural connection, and virtually all the powers and functions of a DG can be delegated. And I suppose one of the key questions that all communities ask themselves is which delegations do we want to take on? What's going to work for us in our community, in our setting? And we're sort of having some of that conversation at the moment. We have seen evidence that when a community-controlled org has delegated, they are delivering better outcomes for our kids and families, either by keeping our kids and families in the care of their family or ensuring that their connection to them is really strong and it's done in a proper way and it's not a piecemeal approach to connection. And so in Queensland, we've got 2 early adopter sites, one in Central Queensland, CQID, and one in the Moreton region, Refocus. And they've both took on delegated authority and have made significant impacts for our children and families. One of the sites, so up in Rocky, CQID took on the delegation for cultural contact. And so through their deep cultural connections, they were able to support a range of kids. But the one story I want to tell you is about a child who had been in the system for a while. They had a cultural care plan that was developed up by the department, and there were only a handful of connections identified within that plan, maybe 3 or 4. And so CQID decided that this was a child that they could really support. they took on responsibility for that through the Delegated Authority program. And within weeks, literally weeks, they were able to identify over 200 cultural connections for that child, which really extended their cultural identity and built a stronger future for the child. Probably if I go back a little bit at this point to the family-led decision-making, in Queensland, we also have a program called FPP, Family Participation Planning, which is the same thing. If we're in control of creating safety and security for our children by making decisions, with families for their own children, are we better placed to have a departmental cultural plan with 4 names on it or an extended mob of 200? When you've got that link to the community and you've got 200 names of extended mob, you're able to be much more, not just flexible, but you've got many more options about creating safety and security for that child within their own mob, rather than having to move out into a non-Aboriginal family, or even an Aboriginal family that's not their mob, or a white family. And so we have been able to see fantastic results out of that, but really driving home the strong connection between, the FPP, the family-led decision-making, as well as the delegated authority. You need both. They're both good on their own, but you need both. And there's a whole lot of other work that I won't go into because I need to stay online. Otherwise, I talk forever about some of the other things that are happening in Queensland that really do link in, so that we're trying to shift the entire support system. Our other site, and I'll shut up now, I'll talk about what I was supposed to talk about. The other site that took on delegated authority in Queensland is Refocus, and they focused in on reunification, so placement of child with parents. And so across the region, there are about 77, maybe a few more now, children on delegations working towards reunification. And in the short time that we've been, doing this work, we've seen a massive increase in kinship care placements, so over 8%, and over 48 children are reunified, meaning that, for this region, it's the first time that we've had more children exit out of care back into their families than enter into care, into the statutory system. And that's something that, when we talk about the enormity of the closing the gap targets and the depths of despair that we've all kind of had for, so long about, where we're at with our families, governments tend to focus on a whole lot of the negative stuff. I always say, but we look for pockets of excellence. So here's a couple of examples where we've got Aboriginal excellence driving massive improvements for our own families. And it's about making sure that we've got the process right, that we can go out and have, empower those communities to implement decisions in the way that they want to implement the decisions, because we know that it can work. And so I'm absolutely confident that in Queensland, as we roll out delegated authority, we're going to close the gap. We're doing a range of things that are all going to work together. And so I'm not negative about it all. I know that when we have the power and control, that we will get the better outcomes. Like, we will see kids stay with their families in the first place. And it is about reorienting it back to that earlier in part of the system. And so really, the pathway to reaching those closing the gap targets that are ambitious is through our self-determination, if we wrap it up in DA or other programs, and that's really critical. So over the next few years, Queensland's focusing on scaling up that work. We've recently, so last week, the Minister signed the blueprint for expanding delegated authority, and it's a 10-year plan that has 3 sub-action plans in there, and the first action plan was included within the blueprint that was endorsed. And I should also note, Catherine, that blueprint not only included a commitment to delegated authority, but it also included the commitment to transition all funding and services for Aboriginal kids to the community-controlled sector as well, up in the front of that plan. And so one of the key takeaways, though, is that every year for the life of this first action plan, there'll be at least one additional community-controlled org take on delegated authority in every region. So what that means in practice is at least 6 every year. So over 3 years, we'll have 18 plus the 2 that we've got now. So we're going to have virtually half the sector within 3 years at least delivering delegated authority for kids and families that are in the communities that they work for. So that's really, really exciting for us here in Queensland. We know that these are the kinds of programs that do make a significant difference. They can only be done by community-controlled organisations, yes, because we've got the right frameworks, the right connections. We understand how to do the work. We know mob. We can engage and, we can support how things work in terms of a holistic wraparound service for our kids and families. But we've also got trust. So one of the key elements in that story that I told you before about that cultural connection plan was trust. That grandma, she knew the history, and no doubt the department would have knocked on her door and said, hey, can we have a yarn about this young one? There's no way in the world that grandma would have given up her family history to the department. Those 200 names would have put all of those mob at risk. And so what we're really clear about is that this is not information that we give over to the department through delegated authority. This is your information. You own that. Under the custodianship of the community-controlled organisation, that's your story, that's your information. And so the conversation that we're having at the moment around data sovereignty, well, this is what it means in practice. This is your story. And through the way that we do our work, we're doing everything we can to protect that, to the extent that in Queensland, the system that's being used, the IT system, well, we're saying we need to be co-designing that. And we need to be able to lock off parts of that system so that the department can't access their own system, so that we can store those stories in a way that meets the needs and the expectations that our communities have for us to keep their information, their stories safe for them. See, I'm going off track now, Catherine, but that's all right. I think it's important stuff. I think, it's really critical that we do continue to strive for increased funding and services. We need to make sure that Aboriginal organisations are funded appropriately and resourced, and that we really are the ones that are driving this change. We've absolutely got capability, and I see it everywhere I go, and all the members, we've got the deadliest blackfellas working for us. What we need is capacity. And when I say capacity, I mean money. Money buys infrastructure, additional staff, systems, processes, physical, infrastructure, all of that stuff. And so from my perspective, we've got a long way to go in making sure that community-controlled orgs are resourced appropriately. And I'll probably try and be a bit quicker on this one, which is around workforce. And we do need to develop a national approach to continuing a sustainable Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child and family sector workforce. And so thinking about the reforms that are rolling out through Queensland at the moment, the only thing that really keeps me up at night is workforce. It's one of those critical things that I don't worry about anything else, but I worry about that. And so developing up a comprehensive workforce strategy alongside real investment into workforce initiatives is absolutely critical to support the sustainability of community-controlled orgs. Those initiatives absolutely also need to be co-designed and led by the community-controlled sector. And where states and territories have got a peak body, that work should be led out by the peak. And states and territories that don't have a peak, governments need to invest in one, because we're absolutely critical in being a buffer for the sector and being able to try to operate at scale in terms of workforce. That's going to be really critical. So there's a recent evaluation of the family wellbeing services in Queensland that showed that we were deadly, one, but also it identified, many rural and remote organisations were very limited in the referral points coming through to them for supporting families, which meant that family wellbeing practitioners were required to have much greater levels of skill and provide much more holistic and comprehensive level of support to wrap around a family. And through engaging with them, as a collective, they highlighted to us that most of them were working with families in high levels of distress, due to overwhelming intergenerational trauma burden that our families often carry. And they're often also being asked to hold this work, to heal the impacts of this within a short-term funding model and short time frame, and that they're not remunerated anywhere near what our government or our mainstream non-government organisations are in order to do the same work. We've also
Yep.
Hey?
You're telling a really good story, but I am going to have to wind you up because
I've got about 30 seconds for you, eh? So many of our, see, this is what we go, you take this time and then you wind me up. That's all good, Catherine. So look, many of our orgs have had limited access to training and development monies, and there's been limited strategic design in undertaking support to build the strengths of the workforce. So I am pleased to see that the action plan has committed to a national approach to building a sustainable and skilled workforce that supports all our children and families. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, my dearly brother. I could listen to you all day. Poor Jamie waiting there in the wings. It was a wonderful conversation. And again, a couple of the things that were twigging in my brain as you were speaking there, Garth. I don't think this one came through, is when you were talking about the grandma and the 200 potential contacts, how that only took a couple of weeks. And yet that particular example was a child that had been in out-of-home care for a very long time. And again, the other thing that was twigging in my brain was recent conversations again with a number of kinship carers who get absolutely no support at all because they do not want the intervention of the child protection system. And again, the difference delegated authority makes in being able to support our families. Thank you, Garth. And I'm cognizant, poor Jamie sitting there in the wings. It's thank you for joining us, Jamie. I think it will be fantastic for our members to hear from you on what's different about this plan. I think you might be on mute.
Go. Thanks, Catherine and Garth, and thank you to everyone for inviting me to make some brief remarks. Us white fellas have had the microphone for a very long time, so I think it's appropriate that I curtail my remarks to a few minutes or two. First and foremost, can I acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people as the traditional custodians on the lands on which I'm participating in this call here in Canberra today, and acknowledge traditional owners and elders past and present across all of the traditional lands and sea countries across this nation, and recognise more than 65,000 years of continuing custodianship and connections to the lands of First Nations communities. And particular quick shout out to the elders on Whadjuk Noongar country, where I was born too many years ago to put a number on, and the mob down at Naarm, where I lived for the first 25 years of my life. The short version, given the time that I've been left, is everything they said. But in essence, what's safe and supported as a national framework, particularly I would advocate from a non-Indigenous organisational perspective, is that we need to, in some instances, get out of the way and let things happen. What we know is that what we've been doing for 230 odd years since the European system was introduced isn't actually working for a significant number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families. And Safe and Supported gives us an opportunity in whitefella language, which is a signed agreement on paper through Closing the Gap and through Safe and Supported. There is a formal agreement between the Commonwealth, the states and territories and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Leadership Group to do things differently. Part of my view of the two action plans is that they need to work hand in glove and they're not separate. They're both doing the same things. They have appropriately different focus points. They have different effort to address things at a different rate and in a different manner to the respective communities and target groups involved. And that's a very important distinction. And we've been very supportive of the significant role, and I do recognise the leadership and expertise of members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Leadership Group, not only in the development of a very comprehensive Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander action plan, but also the significant value and expertise that was born in the general action plan, as Catherine has identified, that applies across the spectrum for all children and young people. We absolutely need to do something differently than we have been doing over recent years. Our child protection rates have gone backwards, and the approaches that we've had aren't working. A couple of key things that I feel, and the National Coalition has advocated for over the development of the action plans, and a challenge that I see for the non-Indigenous sector in the years ahead, is that we need to not only back in and facilitate some of the changes that have been spoken about earlier, such as delegated authority, increasing the viability and size and scope of the Aboriginal community controlled organisational sector, and supporting the development of a national workforce, both for First Nations communities and for non-Indigenous communities. That's a huge issue. But we also need to take on the responsibility of doing our own learning. We need to develop stronger relationships in a respectful manner with organisations in our local communities and regions. It's the responsibility of non-Indigenous organisations to reach out and develop those relationships. And there's heaps of examples across the country where that's done really, really well. Unfortunately, there's also too many examples where it isn't done appropriately, or it isn't done for the right reasons. So we have to take on the challenge and step up to the plate and be prepared to change. And change the way that we do things, change the way that we engage with the system, and change the way in which we support First Nations community leaders, decision makers, and First Nations children and families who do know themselves what's best for them, and how we can influence and create a system that achieves that outcome. And that's not because I want to be a better bureaucrat, or that's not because I want to have great relationships with leaders across the country. It's because we have to do things different to improve the lives, expectations of First Nations children and young people and their families and their communities. And we know that well-supported children and families really thrive within communities where they're connected to kin, culture and law, and can stay on country with the support of their community leaders and elders, and have as little engagement with the Western child protection system as possible. So that's where I would hope, and that's where I advocate for all of our members to be cognizant of how we go about contributing to that environment where responses are led from the community, where self-determination is increased. And a really practical example of that, which Muriel challenged me on a while back, has been not only for a legislated transfer of authority and a transfer of funding and the development of jurisdictional investment programs, but it's also our responsibility as non-Indigenous organisations to pull our head in from time to time and stop bidding and competing for jurisdictional and Commonwealth funding that's primarily focused towards achieving outcomes for First Nations communities, families and children. And if that's where the funding's directed, we actually need to step up to the plate and take on the responsibility of saying, we know that there will be better outcomes produced if that response is led at a local and regional level by Aboriginal community leaders and Torres Strait Islander community leaders. And that's the best outcome that we can achieve for all children and young people in that region and community. So what's my effort as a non-Indigenous organisation? Not to compete for that money at one level. More importantly, how do I support and work as an advocate and ally for local organisations led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members to put them in the best position to secure that money, work in partnership, co-design responses, because ultimately it is about changing the environment that children and families are growing up in. And more broadly, given time, I can't underscore the value of a broader engagement of some of the social determinant issues that Catherine and Garth both referenced to. We do know that we need to focus our efforts through Safe and Supported on the tertiary end. Concurrent to that, everyone, I believe, would support a greater focus on early intervention and primary prevention to slow the rate of people coming to the attention of the statutory system. More broadly, access to adequate and safe housing, economic participation in our communities and appropriate income levels, a reduction of violence, in communities more broadly, and also at a much bigger level, engaging as a nation in the ongoing effects of racism and colonisation and its ongoing impact is something that we all need to engage with as non-Indigenous people. And whilst that's not explicitly, some of those elements aren't explicitly referenced in the action plans, they will be the influences about how much progress can be made. So thanks for the opportunity to have a very quick and brief yarn. In closing, I note Catherine's comment about a voice in policy and some of the agreements that have been reached and committed to by various governments. And Garth has spoken about or provided a number of examples of what can be achieved when you have a voice in policy, and that's the outcome that comes. And imagine how much better a nation will be if we had a voice in Parliament and we were able to extrapolate those outcomes up for all First Nations communities across the country. We appreciate that there's a variety of voices and differences of opinion occurring at the moment within the community, but Families Australia and through that the National Coalition will be voting yes and encouraging people to vote yes. We would encourage people to engage respectfully and encourage our members to look at practical ways in which they can support the conversation about a yes vote getting up later in the year within your local communities and regions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jamie. Now, I'm conscious we did have some Q&As, so we're not going to get to them, unfortunately, but what we're going to do is we'll be able to attach those questions and send them out, the answers to them. But it's really important to talk to you, Mob, all about what's next, and that is the governance structures. How do we get visibility of it? And I know one of the questions in the chat was around, well, how do we find out where different states and territories are at? This is part of that work, is saying, okay, let's take a look at where you're at. Let's take a look at what your decision-making frameworks are. Let's take a look at what your policy frameworks are. Let's take a look at what's blocking, and let's move those blockages. So there's a little bit of a blurb on that in the left-hand side there, but we're hoping to, in line with what Jamie was saying, start getting better at wrestling some of those contracts of government. So that, again, when we're looking at what needs to be done next, it is the Aboriginal community controlled sector that has ownership over that, so that we're not going back out and asking everyone the same questions again, even though we asked them to last week and the week before and the week before. So we'll do a lot of work on the monitoring and evaluation strategy, and again, that will include things like a theory of change and an outcomes framework. And you'll see down in the bottom corner there, looking at how all of this work aligns to things like the Early Childhood Policy Partnership, the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children, and the national plans around disability as well. So there's a lot of work still to be done and still to be lined. Jamie and Garth, it's been wonderful to have you with us. Anyone online, thank you for joining us. And I think I'm going to wrap this up, really ending where I started, which was back on my own grandmother's country, where the grandma in the car with me as we were driving around the base of that incredible cultural institution. You know, funny how people call it a national park. It's a massive cultural institution that played a fundamental role in our families understanding how to care for each other. And as we were driving around the bottom there, one of my nanas said, "Our trees are sick. I'm really worried for this." And again, Aboriginal people in the room will understand what I'm talking about when the trees are sick, because they are our roots. They are our roots for our strength, but they are also how we understand the growth of our children. In a modern context, the way we apply that is through frameworks like this one, and it is the first time we have been able to embed that perspective into a policy that will help our families thrive, and into an action plan that will ensure we're able to invest in those roots so that these trees are strong and our culture is strong. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'll give Garth and Jamie a quick chance to say goodbye. And please keep an ear out. We will be sharing this on our website Garth, I can see you trying to have your mics down.
I was just going to say goodbye, Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. You'll be able to see this on our website again. See you more.
Bye.
Bye.